know why I was nervous now. That is probably the kindest and most thoughtful introduction I've ever had, Cheryl. Thank you very much. You know, when I did learn late yesterday that Cheryl was going to be doing the introductions, and there was a little bit of nervousness, but I thought, you know, it was so long ago. She doesn't really remember the stuff. It would be particularly embarrassing. But, you know, Cheryl has been a trailblazer of her own, and it was clear from back in law school that Cheryl was someone that you wanted right by your side, and that was certainly the case when she was DA, and certainly the case when she was head of the JQC as well. So we all are also indebted to Cheryl for her public service as well, and thank you again for a very kind introduction. I also want to thank Dean White in absentia here tonight for inviting me to speak with you all for a few minutes. Certainly, as Eleanor said, we're all thinking about her tonight. You know, she really presides over a very special place. I think I can admit to you all in this crowd here that I loved law school. I particularly loved law school at the University of Georgia. And certainly part of that was the great professors there, the rigor of the curriculum. But really, when you get right down to it, I think I loved law school because I really liked my classmates in law school. They were fun, witty, clever, engaging people that I just really enjoyed hanging out with. And I think that really came home this year when we had our 25th, which is sort of startling, reunion. And so many of us came back to it. And then we were sending these emails back and forth afterward, sort of gushing over how much we missed each other. And I'm just not sure that happens at every law school. So I think we're all really lucky to have had the experience of going to law school at the University of Georgia. You know, it's particularly appropriate as alumni, I still can't get quite used to saying that, as alumni, that we are getting together here in March because, as I'm sure many of you all know, it's Women's History Month. And this month, you know, every year it has a different theme for Women's History Month, and this year the theme is also particularly apropos. It's women's education and women's empowerment. And the description for this month reads, although women now outnumber men in American colleges nationwide, the reversal of the gender gap is a very recent phenomenon. The fight to learn was a valiant struggle waged by many tenacious women in our country across years and across cultures. Well, indeed, the fight to practice law, to choose this profession and to be admitted to the bar, that was a valiant struggle by our foremothers at the bar. My grandmother actually was part of that struggle. I come from a long line of lawyers in my family. My father was a lawyer. Both of my grandfathers were lawyers, my uncles, my cousins, but my father's mother was also a lawyer. Now, she didn't go to law school. She was raised at a time where you could what they called read law under other lawyers, apprentice under other lawyers. And she did that for several years and then took and passed the bar exam and was admitted in 1924. Just a few years after the State Bar of Georgia in 1916 started admitting women as lawyers. Now, even though, truth be told, my grandmother was without question the smartest lawyer in our family, absolutely including present company, she never actually got to practice law. Nobody in Georgia was hiring a woman to be a lawyer back in the 1920s. So instead, she served as the secretary for my grandfather in his law practice. And then later on, she was the secretary to my father and his brother, my uncle, in their law practice. And you know, I've often thought about how incredibly frustrating it must have been for my grandmother. As smart as she was, and as tenacious as she was, to be relegated to typing other people's thoughts. Well, my grandmother wasn't the only one that was going through this, but this was the world that she knew. There was another famous early female attorney, Myra Bradwell, that some of you all may have heard of before. In 1872, she, like my grandmother, apprenticed under a lawyer. She took the bar exam and she passed with honors, and she applied to her state, which was the state of Illinois, to be admitted to the practice. But the state of Illinois denied her admission. And the reasoning that they gave kind of varied, but it all really was sourced in the fact that she was a woman. At first, they denied her license because she was a married woman and she was to be, get this, and I'm quoting, available to her husband at all times. I'm not entirely sure what that available means. All I know is his Comer doesn't have a wife that's available. Well, she appealed to the Illinois Supreme Court, and they also denied her admission to the bar. And they gave a variety of reasons here. First, they said, well, since the legislature hadn't specifically said anything about women being admitted to the bar, they couldn't possibly have intended that women be admitted. And then they said that they really feared that if we allowed women to be admitted to the bar, that could just open the floodgates. And goodness knows what other civil offices women might want to hold in. And then they said that they were concerned that some of the, and this was their word, brutal cases might not be appropriate for a woman to hear. And then at the bottom line, they said they were just worried about what might happen to the administration of justice if women were involved. The Illinois Supreme Court actually said that God designed the sexes to occupy different spheres of action, and that it belongs to men to make, apply, and execute laws is almost an axiomatic truth. Well, Myra Bradwell wasn't satisfied with that, and she appealed to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1873, in a 7-1 vote, the court upheld the Illinois preventing her from being a lawyer. It was based on essentially a narrow reading of the Privileges and Immunities Clause. But most interestingly, it was the concurring opinion that I think is worthy of our talking a little bit about here. And this was from Justice Bradley. He wrote in, if you can bear with me here for quoting some of this, the civil law, as well as nature itself, has always recognized a wide difference in the respective spheres and destinies of man and woman. Man is, or should be, woman's protector and defender. The natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. He noted that it was divine ordinance that the domestic sphere is that which properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. He argued that the family institution is repugnant to the idea of a woman adopting a separate and distinct career from that of her husband. And he ended with gusto, declaring that the paramount destiny and mission of a woman is to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator. I wonder what Justice Bradley would think looking around this room tonight. There's not a whole lot of delicacy and timidity in this room. And for those of us with children, I wonder, although we may find it challenging at times, I wonder how many of us find that our career is repugnant to family life. I wonder what he would think about women not only being admitted to law school, but how about Dean White? How about Dean White? She's in charge of the place. I wonder how he would feel about that. If Justice Bradley were here, he would see a room full of women who personified this year's theme for Women's History Month, a room of educated and empowered women. Women who are in control of their own destinies. Women who have opportunities and options that are really limited only by our imaginations. But outside of this lovely room, there are some other women. There are women who've never even been given the opportunity to hope or dream about what we do. There are women who know power, but they only know power as something that is exercised against them. Women who are utterly voiceless. And these are the women who are victims of human trafficking. The most recent FBI threat assessment says that Atlanta, our very city here, is the #1 transportation hub for human trafficking and child exploitation. Atlanta, our city. Some of you may wonder why Atlanta? Well, some of the very same things that make us attractive to business also make us an attractive spot for human traffickers. The Atlanta airport is there. It's very easy to be able to move girls in, move them around in the blink of an eye. Men can come in, fly in, have sex with a child, and be home for dinner. We're a city that's known for our sex industry. We have a ready-made market here for victims of sex trafficking. Women fall prey to traffickers really through a whole variety of different kinds of schemes. Some of them are lured to this country with promises of a great job, working as a maid, for example, in a hotel or working in a restaurant. Some of them are lured here through promises of marriage from other countries, most often in our case from Mexico. Some are actually sold into the sex trade by their parents, by their husbands, or by their boyfriends. Some are runaways who are quickly spotted by pimps who usually will first engage them as if they want to be their boyfriend before things start getting brutal. Once the traffickers have isolated the victims, they use a variety of methods to condition them. They beat them, starve them, rape them, and threaten them. Usually, they use psychological coercion to hold the victims captive and to threaten them of what will happen if they escape or disobey or cry out. The victims suffer what's known as traumatic bonding, and this is a situation where it's a type of coercive control that the traffickers have over the victims, where the victims end up feeling fear and gratitude just for being able to live. Sex trafficking operations can be found in a variety of different scenarios in our city. Sometimes it's obvious out on the street, where you see women who are working the streets, but sometimes it's not so obvious. It's the underground, backcountry type of brothels that are really advertised oftentimes either by word of mouth or through the internet. It used to be on Craigslist, and now it's on internet sites on most usually Backpage.com. But they also operate in other places like massage parlors and spas. Strip clubs and other places like that can be fronts for prostitution. Oftentimes women might start out dancing or stripping, and then they end up being coerced into forced prostitution. Not too long ago, our office brought a case that involved 10 young women who had been brought here from Mexico, 4 of whom were young teenagers at the time. The traffickers in this case lured the girls here by promising them marriage. Now, most of these young girls were very poor, most of them were uneducated, and many of them had never even had a boyfriend before. But they were promised that if they came to the United States, that these men were going to marry them and then that they would have good jobs here. But once they were here, they were beaten and abused and forced to have sex with up to 40 men every single night. When one of the victims told the traffickers that she just wanted to go home, he took her head and dumped it into a wooden bucket of water until she felt like she was going to drown. And then when he finished, he threw the bucket at her head. They were kept in houses in Norcross, and they were moved around from one house to another to have sex with the different customers. The traffickers beat them, and then when that wasn't enough, they would threaten to harm their families back in Mexico. The lead defendant in this case was sentenced to 40 years in prison. 9 of these young women came in and testified at the trial and at the sentencing. And they cried as they talked about how the very first night that they came to the United States, they were forced to have sex with 20 men the first night. They courageously faced these animals who had taken so much from them and who had tortured and abused them. And with dignity and grace, they turned the page on an absolutely horrific chapter of their lives. So what do we do about this situation? Well, our office has significantly stepped up prosecutions of human trafficking, but it's going to take a lot more than that. It takes certainly aggressive enforcement, but it also takes effective deterrence and prevention. We've recently been using federal trafficking statutes to be able to send these men to prison for a very long time. We formed an unprecedented task force that's with federal and state and local officials so that we can try to approach this in a comprehensive way. Importantly, we're working with law enforcement to train law enforcement officials to recognize the signs of human trafficking, so they don't just assume that every woman who is a prostitute is there voluntarily. And most importantly, we're working with a lot of community organizations, particularly those in the Latino community, to get the word out to victims that they can come forward, they can speak out without fear of being deported or being prosecuted. Now, standing in this room tonight, I recognize that what I'm talking about probably sounds like an entirely different world. But it's not a different world. It's part of our community. These girls and these women are, but by the grace of God, us. Martin Luther King said that all life is interrelated. Somehow we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be everything I ought to be unless you're everything you ought to be. And for some reason, you can't be everything you ought to be unless I'm everything I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. Well, today, 140 years after Myra Bradwell took her case to the Supreme Court, we look back at how women were dismissed and treated as unworthy to practice law. And it's so far into our culture now, it's almost inconceivable that that could have happened. But as we celebrate how far we have come professionally, there are still women who are being robbed of something far more important and something far more fundamental than a career choice. They're being stripped of their basic human dignity. 140 years from now, what will society say about human trafficking? Will they look back on it as a barbaric, dehumanizing practice that's absolutely inconceivable to them in their modern day culture? Let's hope so. And let's use our not so timid and delicate voices to make sure that that happens. I thank you for giving me a chance to talk with you all here tonight, and I'd be delighted to take any questions.
Are the defendants, the guys who are getting these women, are they U.S. citizens?
Oh yeah, I mean there's the full range. You mean the ones that are the traffickers or the Johns who are using the services?
No, not the Johns. I figure who they are.
Yeah. No, there's, it's the full range. Some of them, for example, in the Cortez Mesa case, they were from Mexico and brought here, but that's just one type of human trafficking. I mean, there's a young girl, in fact, we have a sentencing tomorrow of a man who was pimping a 12-year-old girl. He got her hooked on meth, and then she was having sex to be able to get meth from him. She was 12 years old and was having sex every single day that he was pimping around. Now that's one that's not an organization, that's sort of a single victim that we were dealing with here. But that's a 12-year-old girl. Can you imagine any of our 12-year-olds, enduring something like that? So it's the full range, Terry. It's everything from folks from other countries who bring girls here, but it's men here too that are doing this.
And so the girls, there are girls who are born and raised here too.
Oh yeah.
That they're bringing in, too.
Oh, absolutely. This was just an example of the case from Mexico. Absolutely. It's runaways are oftentimes some of the prime victims in this. Because they're very vulnerable. They're looking for somebody to take them in under their wing. Pimps can spot this just like that, and they're nice to them to begin with. They buy them stuff. They're friendly with them. The girls think they actually want to be their boyfriends, and the next thing they know, that they're forced into this situation. But it's not just teenagers. It's hard for a lot of us, I think, to be able to relate to the idea of somebody who could be forced into this. But we haven't been in their situations before. We haven't been in a situation where we have no support network. We have no family. We have nothing else. And they're able to coerce these women into believing that they deserve this. I mean, that's the really tragic part of it, is you talk to these victims, and the victims believe that they aren't worthy of more than this. This is what their life should be.
I have two questions. The first is, are the trafficking laws strong enough in terms of sentencing, or is there enough being done to make them have longer sentences? And the second question is, if all of us in this room could do one thing to help you with the trafficking, where would we start?
Well, I happen to bring a list of organizations that are available if you all are interested in being involved in this issue. And I'd be glad to email you too more information about this. But there are a number of organizations. There's a group called Street Grace, for example, that's a coalition of churches that's involved in the issue. A really great organization called A Future Not a Past that is also involved in this, and it's involved in a variety of ways, both in terms of reaching out, for example, to the immigrant community. One of the things they're doing, another organization called Wellspring, is particularly for young girls, there are not enough facilities in this state to be able to house the young girls and women who need a place to stay. And what happens, particularly with the teenagers, is oftentimes they run away again when they're placed in a foster home, because the foster parents are very well intentioned, they want to do the right thing, but they're not equipped to be able to deal with this situation. So the girls run away, and they run away and they get right back into it again. So I'd be glad to give you a list or to email you a list of, there's a whole group of Street Grace, Tapestry, Wellspring. The Junior League of Atlanta actually has been very involved in this issue. So I'd be glad to get you a list of those as well.
We can mail that out also.
Okay.
Question for you, Sally. When you were a student in law school, did you ever imagine that you'd be standing here in a position to redirect the destiny of the women that you speak of, and to even speak into the lives of so many Georgia law alumni as well?
Well, I wouldn't be presumptuous enough to say I'm redirecting anybody's destiny. But no, in fact, when I was in law school, I didn't even have any interest in criminal law. I went to a private law firm and was doing civil litigation there and thought that's what I would do forever. And then ended up talking to Dorothy Kirkley, who then later became my sister-in-law when I married Comer. And she had been an AUSA in the office, and I became intrigued with her description of what she did, and it sounded so incredibly interesting and rewarding. And so from that, I then became interested in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Went there, so no, I certainly had no idea I would be doing this. But I'm awfully glad I've gotten the chance.
What
So,
a great impact that we had.
Sally, is this just limited to men trafficking, or are women involved in this as well?
No, usually it's men who are the actual traffickers, but they will oftentimes have, for sex traffickers, they will oftentimes have they call them a bottom girl or a bottom woman, who is like had been their #1 prostitute before, who then becomes like a madam, but madam sounds too genteel for what happens with these women. And she will become essentially the enforcer and will help to, she's been psychologically coerced in this stuff too, but she will become the enforcer in this. So usually it's the men who are the actual traffickers, but they will then employ women who assist them. But I'll tell you a place where women are actually worse than men, and that's in forced labor. I just talked about sex trafficking tonight, but that's not the only kind of human trafficking that's going on. There's also a real problem with forced labor, and in this district we've had several cases where women have brought women from other countries over, and oftentimes they actually come from these other countries themselves, the defendants do, and they bring them over to work as like domestics in their house, telling them they're going to be a nanny and be able to go to college. Well, they get here and they're nothing but a slave, and when I say slave, I mean they are working 24 hours a day. We had one woman who insisted that they cut the grass with scissors out in the front yard instead of even being able to use a lawnmower. So there's something a little twisted about women abusing other women this way, but in the forced labor context, it's been more women doing that than men, but in sex trafficking, mostly men.
Sally, how are you getting these girls and women to come forward? How are you finding the victims?
A lot of times they're found, well, there's sort of a variety of ways. There's no real one way. And like in the labor trafficking cases, oftentimes neighbors will notice something weird going on and will contact law enforcement. In sex trafficking, it comes through either local law enforcement that they may do an arrest, and then finally somebody talks, like one of the girls will talk, or sometimes one of the Johns talks, and you find out about it that way. Sometimes a girl will escape out of a group where you have a large sex trafficking organization going on. One will actually get the nerve to break free and will escape and will tell law enforcement, or tell an organization that tells law enforcement, which is one of the reasons why we're trying to work with a number of the community organizations so much, so that these girls will feel safer coming out. And one of the reasons why we have posters and billboards and all, particularly in the Latino areas of town, so that they can get the message that they're not going to be deported or bad things happen to them if they come forward.
I know that in some of the more rural counties of North Georgia, domestic violence isn't very least in a more domestic scene, have you been experiencing a lot of support from the authorities when these traffickers have kind of been, they've been informed about things, or is that also been a
Yeah,
problem?
I mean, one of the things you have to recognize, it's the local cops who are oftentimes going to be the first ones to encounter a woman who's a victim of trafficking. And so that's one reason why just a few weeks ago, there were 400 plus local law enforcement officers that GBI brought together in Forsyth. And to Governor Deal's credit, he came down, this is an issue that he's really pushing locally as well. And it's not something they think about, but once you educate them about the signs of trafficking, they want to do something about it too. They just don't know to look for these things. I mean, to them, the woman before was, I hate to say just a prostitute, but was there willingly, and they didn't even know to look for the signs of a woman who's not doing this willingly. So they haven't been resistant to it, they're just not really educated about it.
I have two questions. The first one is, how are these services advertised? And just the second one is, how are the Johns commonly prosecuted? And what their punishment, what is
Yeah.
their punishment?
They're advertised on, and then you can go on to Backpage. Well, I don't know if I want to encourage you to go on to that site or not, but you can go on to Backpage and you'll see photographs of girls on there, and they won't say it's for sex, but you can look at it and see that that's exactly what it is. And no, they, particularly with the underage girls, they'll never advertise them as underage. They'll use words like fresh, young, new, I mean, all sorts of, stuff like that, that sort of code in that area. And there'll be women, in provocatively posed, and there'll be a phone number for you to call, and then they book them, like you're booking a hairdresser appointment. Now, they book the girls, and they move them oftentimes from city to city. So they'll say, Teresa is gonna be here Tuesday through Friday, and call this number if you're interested in meeting Teresa. And they'll call the numbers and set it up that way. With respect to prosecution of John, unfortunately, the federal laws don't really apply to the Johns. They apply to the traffickers, but not the Johns. And so that's one of the reasons why we formed this task force to try to work more comprehensively to get our local law enforcement folks, DAs and solicitors even, to prosecute the Johns in this case, because I think you gotta go after the demand side too, not just the traffickers. But keep in mind, it's in their defense, in my local counterpart's defense, you gotta kind of catch them in the act oftentimes to have the Johns. I mean, with the traffickers, you can find them, but the Johns, they're not like keeping a log like the Hollywood Madam did or whatever. I mean, it's not like you have a list oftentimes of them. So it's harder to get them. But look, I think we need to prosecute them. I think in Georgia, there's a provision that if you are prosecuted for pandering, then there's supposed to be an advertisement with your face, your photograph published then. Put up a few billboards of men that might start having a bit of a deterrent effect.
Do these defendants normally work in larger groups or smaller groups that go kind of undetected, or do you see?
It's both. We've been trying to focus more on the large scale organizations, like the one that I described that was from Mexico. But it's absolutely both. We've got that, and then you've got the one-off case of the single pimp and the single 12-year-old as well. But there are both things going on. It's incredibly profitable. Second to drug trafficking, it's the most profitable criminal enterprise in the world. Second to drug trafficking. If you think about it, it's not much overhead. It's pretty much all profit. And on that cheery note.